When you're in the store looking at sewing machine needles, how do you know which one to use? I mean, does it really matter which one you use? And what are all those numbers and slashes anyways? Is there more to consider than just the size? Well, yes, there certainly is. A needle is, in a lot of ways, like the tires on your car. Tires on your car don't seem like much compared to the engine and the drive shaft that make the wheels turn. But if your tires are bald in an ice storm, does your car have any chance of moving no matter what the engine is doing? The tires are the connection between that engine and you getting down the road. Needles are the connection between your sewing machine and getting stitches in your fabric. And they have to interact with both the fabric and the thread as they make those stitches. By the end of this video, you're going to know what all the different parts of a needle are and how they differ from needle to needle in ways that make sewing with different fabrics and different threads easier. Kind of like being able to drive down the road regardless of the weather conditions because you have the right tires. Plus, you'll understand the needle equivalent to all-weather tires and when you need to decide to change to a different needle for specific conditions. Let's start with the size of the needle. That's these numbers. There are two because there are both European and US measurement systems. The metric system is based on 1/100ths of a millimeter. So a size 80 needle is 80 1/100ths of a millimeter wide. It's helpful to remember that it's actually based on a measurement so that when you're comparing a size 70 to a size 120, you'll remember that the bigger number means the bigger needle. This is also the same with US measurements. The bigger number means a bigger needle. Larger in what way? The size refers to the diameter or the thickness of the shaft. You can see in these two needles, the one on the left is a size 75 and the one on the right is a size 100. And you can see that the size 100 is thicker. Thicker equals stronger. But why does a needle have to be strong? Well, it has to poke through the fabric and stay straight as it does so. In order to make a stitch, a needle has to be in a certain position inside the machine. It goes down into the machine and then part of the machine comes around right next to the needle, right there. That's called the hook, and it picks up the thread. And you can see that if the needle is bending, if I just push it a little bit, it could be hitting the hook and thereby breaking it or actually damaging the hook. Or if it was being pushed the other way away from the hook, it might not be able to catch that thread to make the stitch. So you want your needle to be big enough or strong enough so it does not bend when it goes through the fabric. But why do we not then use size 120 needles for everything we sew? Well, because bigger needles mean bigger holes in your fabric. If you have a very fine fabric and use a size 120 needle, it might leave some noticeable holes in your fabric with the seam. You want to pick the size of needle that is appropriate for the weight or thickness of your fabric. One that is strong or thick enough so that it doesn't bend as it's poking through, but also not too big so that it doesn't leave unnecessarily large holes as you're sewing. But there's more going on with needles than just the size. Otherwise, the store display would be pretty simple. It would just have all the different size needles and that's it, no other options. There are 4 other ways in which needles can differ from one another, and they all have an effect on how happy you are with your sewing, especially as you start using different unique kinds of fabrics and threads. First is how the point differs. It's pointy, right? Actually, the points on different kinds of needles are different. And it used to be that there were just 3 different types of points. And knowing the differences between these 3 types of points will help you understand all the other points that are out there now. These 3 different types of points were the sharp, the ballpoint, and the universal. Sharp points are just what you would expect, nice and pointy. These needles are good for going through tightly woven fabrics. Because they are sharp, they can cut right through the fabric. And sometimes these sharp points can accidentally cut a little thread in your fabric. If you cut one little thread in some woven fabric, it doesn't necessarily unravel very fast. Think about when you get holes in your jeans. The hole is usually where specific threads have worn out. There could be still some threads going across, right? The hole doesn't necessarily keep expanding beyond the point where that one thread is cut. But what happens with knit fabrics? Knit fabrics are like little miniature sweaters. A sweater is knit with one yarn. So if you cut one little thread, it's going to unravel fast like a sweater would. So if you use a sharp needle on a knit fabric, it can catch some of those threads and then break them and cause runs in your fabric. So they invented ballpoint needles. They still seem sharp to your finger, but they actually are a little rounded on the end. Because they are rounded, they're less likely to actually catch on those threads as they're poking into the fabric. Knit fabrics are also a little easier to poke through. Think about poking your finger through a knit sweater versus poking through your woven coat. But because of that rounded tip, again, that ballpoint needle is going to have a hard time poking through woven fabric and make it a little more likely that it's going to bend and move as it's going through the fabric. So really, you'd want to have a ballpoint needle for your knit fabrics and a sharp needle for your woven fabrics. But then there was a third option, and that was the universal needle. Universal needles are a little like all-weather tires. They're slightly rounded. They're in between a sharp and a ballpoint. So just like all-weather tires are good for most road conditions, universal needles are good for most sewing projects. But just like if you're driving over the mountains in the winter, you probably don't want to do it with all-weather tires. You probably want something special, like snow tires or even chains. The same happens with universal needles. If you have special fabric or special thread, then you're going to want a special needle. Nowadays, manufacturers have all different kinds of points of needles for all different kinds of fabrics, but they will still use the terms sharp and ball and universal. So when you're reading those packages, now you'll understand what they're talking about. But there's a lot more on those needle packages than just what kind of point there is. We covered the size of the needle and the point of the needle. Now let's talk about the eye of the needle. The eye is where the thread goes through, and different types of needles have different kinds of eyes on them. A bigger eye can be useful not only for thicker thread, but also to protect fragile threads from the extra friction of going through the eye. Like these two needles, both these needles are a size 80 needle. The needle on the right is just a plain ballpoint size 80 needle for jersey fabric. The needle on the left is designed for metallic threads, and you can see it has a much bigger eye. The bigger eye can be useful not only for thicker thread, but also to protect fragile threads from the extra friction of going through the eye. The thread actually passes back and forth through that eye lots of times before it actually gets used in the stitch. This is because when every stitch is made, the take-up lever gives the machine a little bit of extra thread and then pulls it away again. So that thread goes back and forth through the eye until it actually gets used in the stitch. So reducing that wear by something like a bigger eye is really important for fragile threads. The next part of the needle is the scarf. The scarf on the needle is right behind the eye on the back side of the needle. It's this little indent here behind the eye. It's there to give a little bit of extra space when the hook comes around behind the needle. If you are sewing things that tend to grab and pull on the needle, like highly elastic knits, a larger scarf gives the machine more room to grab the thread, so you'll have fewer skipped stitches. And the last thing that's different about needles is the coating. Needles nowadays have all different kinds of coatings, from things like titanium that help the needle not get sticky adhesive residue from using fusibles, to even just plain old chrome plating that helps the needle slide through a little easier. Are you overwhelmed? When I'm picking a new needle for a project, the first thing I do is go pick the right size. And then if I am using special thread or special fabric, then I go read the back of the packages and see which ones mention my kind of sewing that I'm doing with that thread and with that fabric. And now that you know all these terms, the backs of those packages are going to make a whole lot more sense. Manufacturers nowadays seem to be coming up with a new thing every year, so it's good to just be able to read the package because there might be something new and different that's going to make your life a whole lot easier. Needles seem like such tiny things and the differences are even smaller, but picking the right needle can mean the difference between fighting your machine and happy sewing.